One of the most significant and well-watched events in the music industry is the dissolution of the legendary band the Beatles in 1970. The band was at the top of the world in the 1960s, making history with their classic songs, but by the end of the decade, things started to go south for them. The true reason for this breakup was the subject of years of conjecture. Over the years, legendary bassist Paul McCartney has been open about his disappointments, especially with the influence of Yoko Ono, John Lennon's wife. Many fans in the studio have accused her of causing the breakup, making her the media's scapegoat. But according to McCartney's most recent thoughts, it's more nuanced than that. Let's now explore the specifics of the breakup, McCartney's changing opinions about Ono, and further potential causes for the band's dissolution. Through a series of interviews spanning more than 50 years, learn what actually transpired between them during the Beatles' breakup and whether they were ever able to get back together. It was hardly surprising that the Grammy winner was initially frustrated with Ono. The friction that Lennon's new artistic pursuits and personal relationships with Ono caused is largely responsible for the rupture between the band's two main engines, Paul McCartney and John Lennon. McCartney claims that Ono spent a significant amount of time in the studio during the recording of the White Album. None of the band members objected to this, but it wasn't without hesitation. The bassist had alluded to the escalating tensions by calling Ono a distraction at work. How embarrassing that must have been. One clear indication of John Lennon's changing priorities was his insistence on having his wife on set. It's interesting to note that Ono actively influenced Lennon's creative process rather than only being a passive witness. According to others, it must have caused McCartney and the others to feel excluded, which further strained group chemistry and complicated recording. Everyone was undoubtedly frustrated by the circumstance. Yet they kept silent to minimize confrontation and also boost productivity. They did it because it had to be done, McCartney said. It was not negotiable, it was their job. He examined the specifics of Ono's position within the Beatles in a recent episode of his podcast, McCartney, A Life in Songs. He claims that the couple's reunion was certain to have an impact on the dynamics of the group. You had to deal with things like Yoko practically being in the middle of the recording session. He remarked that this should occur if John desired it to. It shouldn't for any reason. Being the first to leave the group, Lennon's actions undoubtedly did not help. Although the world was informed of this information only later, Paul McCartney was initially supposed to bear the brunt of the group's failure. It must have made him even more enraged. But this is not where the narrative ends. Over time, Paul McCartney had a startling change in opinion on Ono. Decades after the split, McCartney stated in an interview that it was an oversimplification to attribute the Beatles' breakup to Ono. In order to absolve Yoko Ono of responsibility and possibly put an end to the conflict surrounding his alleged quarrel with Lennon's widow, he later disclosed that the band had already been on shaky ground and had begun the journey's final stages before Ono. It would be incorrect and unreasonable to attribute the split to Ono as the only and primary cause. This narrative change was significant because McCartney was able to distance the widow from the decades of animosity she had been subjected to by the band's ardent supporters. Ono likens the way their fans treat her to being falsely accused of murder. She must have felt so relieved to move on from all of this. McCartney went so far as to say that he believed the two were a formidable team and made a wonderful couple. Rather than blaming a single individual, a complex combination of factors led to the split. What specifically led to the Beatles' dissolution, then? Let's examine some further potential causes for the group's dissolution as well as the more profound causes behind the demise of one of the most significant bands in music history. There were a number of causes, such as the conflict between personal objectives and creative differences, which shouldn't be attributed to a single woman. There were a lot of creative disagreements inside the group by the late 1960s. The artistic direction of each Beatles member had been changing over time. Lennon, greatly influenced by his wife Ono, was experimenting with his music and delving into avant-garde art. McCartney, on the other side, was gravitating toward more conventional pop tunes. Tension between two artists who had collaborated for years grew as a result of this shift. It must have been instinctive to attribute the gap to the new outsider. It must have been difficult to collaborate because of this independence, which even made room for the group's dissolution. The four distinct yet powerful personalities in one band were destined to break up, as McCartney acknowledged. The Beatles' quick climb to prominence put them under a lot of pressure, which was inevitable to have an adverse effect. This is another issue to consider. The band stopped traveling by the late 1960s and devoted all of its time to the studio. Even while it produced some of the most recognizable records, it was also the time when the band's flaws began to appear. The band members found it challenging to work solely on set because they hadn't been on tour in a long time. The change in management was one of the many intricate factors that contributed to the band's dissolution. A large portion of McCartney's displeasure and frustration was aimed at Alan Klein, their most recent manager. The band struggled without their manager's direction after Brian Epstein's their former manager, passed away in 1967. McCartney did not get along with the new manager. "I wanted to fight the new manager primarily so that I could later continue to give a lawsuit to Klein to stop him from dealing with the band's finances," the bassist says. After that, McCartney took a short hiatus. McCartney's psychological well-being suffered during this time of seclusion in Scotland. He began to doubt not only his future but also his position in music history as a result of the weight of losing the Beatles and the legal disputes. In interviews, he has recalled that he battled to find purpose in his life, sometimes feeling lost and uncertain, and that he resorted to alcohol. McCartney didn't find a new purpose until his wife, Linda, urged him to begin making music once more. Despite being difficult, this stage of his life ultimately prepared the groundwork for Wing's development and his solo career. But despite his newfound success, McCartney had to deal with the Beatles' shadow for years to come, which made him think back on it several times in his interview before forgiving and clearing Ono of responsibility. It's safe to assume that the Beatles' demise was inevitable given the growing tensions and the new dynamic. Even though the divorce had been the most difficult time in McCartney's life, he was able to appreciate the complexity of these things when he looked back on the past. However, one thing became evident: Ono was not the antagonist that the Beatles' tale had portrayed her as. The Beatles' dissolution was not the consequence of a single event, but rather of a series of conflicts, adjustments, and personal growths that, looking back, seemed all but inevitable. The change in their creative dynamic was one of the most obvious causes. As time went on, Lennon and McCartney's once harmonious and cooperative songwriting collaboration started to fall apart. Although they were both powerful musicians, John and Paul's ideas about the band's future began to vary. While Lennon, who was more affected by his personal life, and Yoko Ono, moved toward more experimental, raw, and avant-garde tendencies, McCartney strove to maintain the band's core by favoring polished, melodic pop and controlled recording sessions. What started out as a mutually beneficial collaboration turned into a kind of rivalry as each of them pushed their own ideas, widening the gap with each recording session. Even George Harrison had his complaints. Harrison's songwriting had developed to the point where he believed his contributions merited equal recognition by the late 1960s. Nevertheless, he was continuously eclipsed by the Lennon-McCartney powerhouse. Songs like Something and Here Comes the Sun were unquestionably classics. However, Harrison's annoyance increased since his creative voice was frequently ignored while the band's creative direction was being discussed. Harrison even left a recording session at one point, underscoring the underlying animosity. However, Lennon's changing relationship with Yoko Ono was possibly the greatest personal setback. Although Ono was frequently held accountable for disbanding the group, the truth is much more nuanced. Lennon and Ono had a close relationship, and she played a significant role in both his personal and creative lives. Tension arose from her being in the studio while the other band members were recording something they had never done before. However, it was more about what Ono stood for: Lennon's increasing yearning for autonomy, for a life and a musical identity apart from the Beatles, than it was about Ono herself. Lennon was obviously ready to move on, and the unity that had once characterized the Beatles diminished along with his dedication to the group. Their separation seemed almost inevitable given the demands of celebrity, the significance of their legacy, and the shifting dynamics of their private lives. In retrospect, it is clear that the Beatles had outgrown themselves. Each member had their own goals, aspirations, and creative requirements, and was on a distinct path. For the four members, the split was a necessary progression, but for their millions of followers, it was a painful pill to swallow. The Beatles' demise was as traumatic for McCartney as it was for the fans, but it gave each of them the opportunity to discover their own voice away from the shadow of the greatest band in history, as he would later reflect. What are your thoughts on McCartney's opinions regarding Yoko Ono? Considering everything, what do you believe to be the true cause of one of the most amazing band's breakups? Do you think that Ono had a role in the band's dissolution and that Ono's treatment was appropriate and deserved as a result? Please leave your opinions in the comments section below. We would love to hear what you think. I appreciate you watching.